everything that happens there, or the domestic sphere, if you will, and also the public sphere. On the gates means the city gate, so it will govern the political life. Your politics will be influenced by the love of God and his word in his character. So all things, it's totally comprehensive. Now, that's in Deuteronomy, and it reflected the transformation or the use of the synagogue. Now, the temple, as we know, was used for Deuteronomy. The temple was used for sacrifice. But the synagogue was used for education, and the synagogue was at least as important as what happened in the temple. Go away. Here it's echoed. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. It has a practical, earthly consequence. Shalom in the world, not just peace with God, but also peace in the world. Transformation of the world. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. No translation can capture the Greek here. The Greek is paideia and nouthesia. Paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. It's the Greek word for everything that was expressed in Deuteronomy 6. It's enculturation in every area of life. That's what paideia means. It's a Greek word. He doesn't need to repeat Deuteronomy 6 there because paideia covers it all. Remember, the Greeks teach their kids gymnastics and the Olympic Games and the practical arts. It's not just intellect. Every citizen has to be ready to fight. Everyone. So they have to be physically able. Even as an adult, as an old man, you still have to be able to defend the city. And the other word, which is translated here as instruction, is nouthesia. It contains the Greek word nous or nous, N-O-U-S, which is mind. So the thes it's a setting, so it's a resetting of the mind. It brings to mind Romans 12. Offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice, for this is your spiritual act of worship. No longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but rather be transformed by the renewal of your minds. So it is an intellectual transformation which is necessary. Note that the assumption is no longer be conformed to, that because of your culture and because of your own sinful nature, you will be conformed to the pattern of this world. That's how you start off. So you need to be transformed by the love of God and the love of your neighbor in your education process, and the education never stops. So I think that's interesting, and it is reflected in Milton's of education here, because it's to repair the ruins of our first parents. Go back to the original. By regaining to know God aright. And then he will go on to say, in order to fit a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously all the offices, both private and public, of peace and of war, of all things, in other words. So there's a practical benefit. Now that's the aspect that I think most people overlook. So yes, education, repair the ruins of our first parents. I'm going to talk about that just in a second. But the second aspect of Milton's of education, which most people overlook, is that it is meant to prepare people to be useful in every area of life, not just to be theologians or academics or philosophers, which you might think it was just because of the enormous reading it seems to prescribe. But the purpose of the reading is to make you an active and able citizen in every sphere of life. Let me go back to this, repair the ruins of our first parents. I need to say this because the aim of education in the form with which we have received it is no longer the aim of education of our educators. The progressivist educator John Dewey will see that the aim of education is to advance education, not leaving it satisfied with knowing what has been known, but teaching new things, things that have never been taught before. That's the aim of modern state education. John Dewey's the most famous spokesperson for this, but it is widely shared. Dewey's pragmatic, it's called pragmatism as a philosophy. The aim of the pragmatist educator is to educate for the future without reference to the past. It's for a world that does not yet exist. So it's utopian in that sense. Because if you remember, utopia is a place that doesn't exist. Fit for the future. And the future is not going to look like the past. Now, I would go too far off topic here to talk about C.S. Lewis's critique of that in his work on education, The Abolition of Man. I'll do that in my sci-fi subcreation class. And I think I'm going to do it in Dr. Scott's class on Christ and Culture, or whatever it's called now. Christianity and Culture? Okay. I think I'm probably going to do it there as well. There's a critique of it, and the aim is very different than this. Milton's aim is a very modest one. Despite the reading list and despite how arduous it seems, it's a modest one. It's to restore the ruins. So it's just to recover what was lost. The assumption there is that Adam was the all-knowing, all-able man. He was, remember, Christ is called the second Adam. That speaks pretty highly of Adam, I would say. We think of Adam as this, the sinner that he is, and no doubt true. But from what height did he fall? He was a perfect man. In Renaissance humanist thought, it was believed that Adam's knowledge of the world was pretty comprehensive. So he knew things to the point where he was able to name them. And when he named them, he defined their essence. Didn't just arbitrarily, well, I'm going to call a box a circle. Like, that's a box. By the word box, he had a very specific thing in mind, and it would relate to other words. So he defined it in its inmost qualities. That was the name he gave to it. And so in the Renaissance period, one of the great interests of the period is to recover Adam's language, his original language, because if you can recover his language, then you can recover his thought patterns. And if you can do that, then you can restore the ruins of our first parents, and it will be, to some degree, undoing the effects of sin, the noetic effects of sin, the effect on the mind. And if you understand things in their essence, in their true nature, then you can act consequently. So that's the drive behind learning languages. You learn them all as they get diversified and as they break apart after Babel into 1,000 different languages. Yeah, but if we can recover all of them, what's the language behind the language? Is there an original language? Some will say it's Hebrew in this age. Most say no, but Hebrew might be closest to it. But it's not it. But see, that's why the interest in language. It's there all the way into our friends Tolkien and Lewis. They are still animated by this great drive to recover a deeper and more true view of the world, which has been lost, but can be recovered by learning ancient tongues. And in the ancient myths, our contemporary Jordan Peterson's talking about the importance of archetypes in the Bible and other stories. It's the same sort of core idea, that actually there are truths not only that need to be discovered, as the Deweyan progressive educator thinks, but actually there are truths that have been covered up and lost and can be recovered and restored. And by doing so, humanity will be better for it. And then I could go on talking about the myth of the orphan, which comes in the internet. But then I'll really go off topic. But some of you have heard me on this ideal of living as people in the world who have no parents, no past, who can redefine their own future as a heroic act. My experience of that is we end up with ignorant people that don't know about themselves. They have to redefine themselves. And they don't even know what that means. They end up anxious all the time. So I think it's disastrous. But so note Milton's emphasis. It's to repair the ruins of our first parents. Now, how do you do that? By regaining to know God aright. The Deuteronomic emphasis, and it'll be there in Ephesians as well. You love the Lord your God with all that. That's what Jesus says. What is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord, quotes Deuteronomy. Love your neighbor as yourself, quotes Leviticus 19, verse, 18, I think. Love your neighbor as yourself. He quotes those two things. And what is thereby? Well, God and humanity, everything. Comprehends all things there. But since you cannot know everything about everything, we're going to go to those who have chiefly been renowned for wisdom, namely the Greeks. That's why he emphasizes Greek. He's not, these days he would be called, obviously, a racist, Western emphasis, the focus on Western literature and so forth would be too partial to his own people and time. But he says we're going to learn the language of those people who have at any time been most industrious after wisdom. So that language is but the instrument conveying to us things useful to be known. And though a linguist should pride himself to have all the tongues that Babel cleft the world into, yet if he have not studied the solid things in them as well as the words and lexicons, he were nothing so much esteemed a learned man as any yeoman or tradesman, competently wise in his mother dialect only. So, since you can't learn every language, let's go to the ones chiefly renowned for wisdom, namely the Greeks. And you will note that in the English language, every intellectual discipline has a Greek origin. It's named after that because the Greeks named them, the various disciplines. These were taken up into the church. Passed on. The classical methods of the ancient world were adopted and transformed, I will also say, by Christians. So you learn the original Greek, not because we particularly like Greece, but because the Greeks seemed particularly industrious after wisdom. The Romans thought they were wonderful. And it's simply because we don't have enough time. It's not that you can learn something from the ancient Chinese or from Sanskrit, from Indian language, but and Milton probably would say, go ahead and do it, but we don't have enough time, and it's all about practical outcome. So let's go after the wisest first and read it in the original. That's why. That's why Greek. Whether you agree with the rationale or not, at least it makes sense. But note that he doesn't say, this is also interesting, he doesn't say so that you can read the New Testament in its original. He never says it. And that's because this is one of his critiques of schools. Schools are there to produce churchmen, clergy, pastors. Milton's not very happy about that. Not that he doesn't think pastors need to be educated, but he thinks everyone needs to be educated and deserves an education, not just those who are going to go into the clergy or just going to be teachers. He thinks that people who are going to be active in the world and useful in their society need to be equally educated. So it's not going to be the purpose of education isn't to create more academics and scholastics. That's what he's pushing back against, actually. So as astonishing as it might seem, Milton is writing an anti-academic treatise of education. Because up to this point, the schoolmen, the scholastics, have education in their grip. He wants it to be practical, to be useful. Remember, the second purpose is to fit a man to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously, with great spirit. All the offices, both private and public, of peace and of war, of all things. We need not just